Okay, great. Thanks so much for the introductions. And it's unfortunate that my colleague and myself are unable to make it in person. It looked like a very interesting conversation, and we're glad to be a part of it all the same. And I will take 10 minutes to talk about the work that we did. And I'm also joined by my colleague Avni on this call, who led the research on this piece. And there's a third author, Surabhi Hodigere, who contributed to this research as well. Having said that, I am Soujanya. I work as a senior researcher at Aapti Institute. And just by way of introductions, Aapti is a Bangalore-based technology policy think tank. And we've been doing extensive research for the past 6 years on themes like inclusion, access, and governance. And this began with thinking about building bridges to large-scale public use of technologies. How do citizens access it, negotiate it? What is the new regime of rights that are born from large-scale public deployment of technologies? And we, sort of expanded our thinking on this work by working with MOSIP, which is the modular open source identity program. It is the code stack on which a lot of identity systems are built on. And MOSIP, we're working on the question of inclusion and gender, and finally about the work that I'm presenting today. And Aapti's core thesis has been that a lot of conversations around public deployment of technologies, particularly DPGs and DPI, have been overwhelmingly technical in nature. And Mark just alluded to conversations around privacy by design or fairness, right? But it's almost as if researchers in this space or people building these systems think of these as narrow technical fixes, while our argument and our research indicates that it is more than just, a function of technology, which is why it becomes just as crucial to consider the non-technology layers, which become a part of the broader stack of digital public infrastructure itself. And in doing so, we think of non-technical layers as comprising three elements, beginning with thinking about financing and sustainability. Two is governance, which is what I will be speaking about today. And third is what is the role of communities, particularly open source communities, as a lever to keep DPI, DPG sustainable in the long run, right? And this work was conducted over the past 2.5 years with support from Omedia Network India. And what has been interesting is also translating some of this work to embed the tools in digital public infrastructure emerging, or related use cases emerging from India, which is where Aapti is based out of. I will just quickly walk you through how we think about the non-technology framing. And as I said, we think DPI is comprised of two distinct but complementary layers, which is the technology stack and then to the non-technical layer. And in turn, we break down the non-technical layer to three levers. One is sustainability, financing, but also what are the non-financial instruments someone can use and think of to support and further DPI. And then the second one is safeguards or governance, and what are the options that exist to govern DPI, and what are the lessons also of governance that emerge from existing DPI, right? So that's the bit on safeguards. And the third is, as I mentioned, communities, both as an important stakeholder in how DPI built and deployed, but also an important and crucial element to thinking about sustainability, contextual embedding of DPI, right? So those are the three elements. And we think a lot of the DPI conversations are fundamentally underscored by a push to think about capacities, whether of regulators, but also of the local technology ecosystems and the larger realpolitik within which DPI is deployed. And specifically, this work is looking at two of three pillars of the non-technical layers, and I will be speaking about the safeguards and governance framework in detail today, but just generally, an overarching overview is that pillar one looked at how do you build capacity of open source communities to participate in emerging DPG initiatives, right? And we did this as a participatory action research with two DPG collectives in India, which have been at the forefront of developing many open source based models, but with proprietary inflections all the same. So I hesitate to call them wholly open source. Having said that, we work with Beacon and eGov on that, and it's been interesting. And I'm happy to share details from that work. But today I will be discussing the governance work, where we look at safeguards as a broader function of building more resilient and accountable DPI systems. And we think, and we've arrived at a normative framework to think about how do you govern DPI, right? And the normative framework is interesting because a lot of conversations, contemporary conversations about DPI governance have been reduced to thinking about regulation or thinking about the role of the state. But we think, and our research also indicates, that governance is a overarching process that needs to cover the variety of stakeholders who are involved in the DPI ecosystem, of which private sector is a big part. So part of the governance principles are stuff that you can also implement in stakeholders other than the government, right? So in doing so, we arrived at four buckets of principles, which is thinking about equity and inclusion. Second is about privacy. Third, about transparency, and then the last one about collaboration. And this work is in its final stages. We will make the report apparent, but just a note on the method for this work, which is that we relied on extensive expert conversations as well as some measure of previous literature and desk research, but the bulk of it is a first of its kind landscape analysis of 10 plus global DPI, of which 4 or 5 from India and the rest from other parts of the world, whether it is FarmStack in Ethiopia or Philsys in Philippines or Brazil's BICS. And we use that as a way to understand what are the governance metrics and indicators that have emerged from these systems, right? And the output for this work is in two types. One is reports. We have a shorter India report that gives recommendations for Indian stakeholders in the DPI ecosystem. And the second is a broader governance based book that speaks to global priorities. And so essentially I will just take the next few minutes to deep dive into how we're thinking about the DPI governance normative framework itself. And as I mentioned, we have 4 anchor principles guiding our larger framework, and these principles themselves were derived from international humanitarian law, but also Indian and constitutional frameworks from around the world. And how do we, establish the scope for the study is very essentially thinking about a definition of digital public infrastructure and a definition for governance, and breaking down the D, P, and I elements to locate the intersection at which this governance framework can be deployed, right? So we think digital technology is one that necessarily stores and processes data and evolves at a fast pace, because that seems to be a consistent feature among a lot of DPI conversations. And public is a function of the impact it has, not a function of who is deploying it or who is building it. And lastly, infrastructure, and we borrow from legacy economics and econometric discourses on what is what qualifies as an infrastructure. And this is the framework itself. And we think the framework is particularly compelling because we go beyond governance, again, as a function of just regulation or policy making, to look at the different ways in which you can make governance happen, right? And we think governance can also be embedded in how you build technology, which is the whole techno-legal approach that has been a big part of India's conversations around DPI, but also legal mechanisms, also operational guidelines that emerge from nodal agencies that sort of roll out the DPI, right? And just a note on how this framework itself works is we have anchor principles, which are 4 in number, and each of those principles lend themselves to specific tools through which they can be deployed. And the tools themselves can be, as I said, in the nature of legal mechanisms, policy mechanisms, technology, design levers, as well as operational guidelines. And in turn, the tools are substantiated with examples from existing DPI of how it can be translated, right? So I will not belabor the normative framework itself, but to just give you an idea, for instance, the first one is inclusion, access, and equitable, and that DPI should be equitable. And the rationale for such a principle is that DPI have become a very big part of the contemporary welfare state framing. And the sources through which we derive this normative principle are also mentioned, which is the UDHR and the Indian Constitution here. And some of the ways in which you can think about implementing inclusivity, accessibility, and equitable DPI is establishing active internal feedback portals or providing government subsidies and exemptions for expansion, which I can tell you is a model that is followed in Brazil for PICS. It's a model that is followed in India for finance DPI called UPI. And codifying integration with offline architecture is also something that's very interesting, because DPI is conceived as an online-only experience, but there is a whole host of processes and steps to be followed or thought about before one is able to access the tech. So how do you bridge the offline and the online, which is how we think about this. And for instance, UPI is again another example of a DPI that has been trying to think about offline architectures. You can transfer money without being connected to internet or Wi-Fi or any of that, right? So that is one way you're building bridges to the DPI system, particularly among people and populations where internet access can be patchy, but also few and far between. And the next, principle framing is privacy preserving and secure. Admittedly, this is less radical than we'd like it to be, because a part of the study is being able to capture some of the existing governance mechanisms. But having said that, and one thing that is lacking in current DPI discourse is to think critically about the data that gets generated as a part of a lot of these DPI deployments, and how do you use it without it becoming just another exhaust, right? So I think the crux of the privacy preserving and security principles for DPI lies in how you handle the data, but also mechanisms for social audits and risk assessments are just as critical to think about the resilience of these infrastructure. The third principle set is thinking about how can you enable public benefit as almost a core guiding principle of DPI, right? Which is why we say that it's important to have consultative processes, not just with technologists or private entities, but also with civil society organizations in thinking about how to build these systems. And interoperability and modularity is again a big deal, so that DPI are not built in silos, but are built in a way to speak to other systems that already exist in the country. And as Carsten just mentioned, one of the interesting things that we're doing one of the things that happened in India is that the ID program got rolled out in the early 2000s, and when the financing DPI, UPI came about, the reason a lot of people were able to set it up instantly is because your ID number is linked to your bank account. So the way of verifying and targeting was made somewhat simpler. I'm not saying this doesn't come with its own complications about exclusion and access, but it is still a good example to reckon with when thinking about interoperability and modularity. And thinking critically about open data sharing and protocol-based models for building DPI is another element of the tools to operationalize the collaboration and public benefit principle. Lastly, the commitment to transparency and accountability is critical, particularly for systems that enjoy such mass deployment, but also influence critical development outcomes like welfare, education, health, and so on, right? So it's important to have, a paper trail even to be able to know who is responsible for what system to be implemented. And given that DPI is a composite of many stakeholders, even things like small paper trails are an important starting point. And it's important to also think about how do you use risk and impact assessments, right? You can mandate that these things should be conducted, but how do you incorporate the results from these processes in an important way to also think about accountability and also layered grievance redressal mechanisms. It can't be that there is one toll-free number that would be the silver bullet to all solutions, but you need to have mechanisms for appeal, mechanisms for remediation, and a system where multiple entities are able to speak to each other, all of which to say it is critical that DPI systems are built accountable from the start and not as just a mere consequence of enjoying large-scale deployment. And we're happy to share ongoing research from this work, and the playbook itself will be ready in the next couple of weeks. Having said that, this is just a snapshot of some of the case studies that we conducted to build this normative framework. And there are 10 in number, and some of the criteria on which these case studies were shortlisted essentially is thinking about the diversity in approach to delegation. For instance, ID systems around the world are held very closely by the federal or union governments, while you could similarly argue with finance in DPI, while, for instance, healthcare or farming DPI are those which are held by like either sector-specific authorities or by smaller provincial governments. And elsewhere, vertical and horizontal impact, this again talks about whether it is cuts across sectors in the context of identity or speaks to a specific sector in the context of health or farming. Scale of adoption is another important element, because some of the DPI we considered are still very much at the level of prototyping of POCs. So while an Aadhaar or a PIX has been deployed for a bit longer. And the last one is the other important part is built on DPGs versus building blocks. This is an emerging point of research for all DPI, DPG researchers, because thinking of DPI as a composite of many elements is critical to ensure that there is reusability as well as modularity in how you build it. And it's impossible to think that you can build these systems without relying on other building blocks and DPG. So this is just the overview of the case studies we did. I've mentioned 3 here, which is UPI, PhilSys, and ONDC. But as I said, there are 7 more to follow. And this is a case study that we're building repository, and we're happy to share this as well. And just as a FYI, and this is born of our experience from, reviewing and inviting expert reviewers to comment on our framework, which is that the best way to look at the interconnectedness of the different principles as well as tools is to be able to lay it out in such a format that people are able to explore it. And which is why we're, building the DPI governance guide. It's in its beta stage, and if anybody's interested, I'm happy to send the link for feedback, but it is fashioned as a design tool. It's based on the normative framework that we recommend in this research and allows users to navigate the framework through 3 vectors, which is the principal type that I mentioned, but also stakeholder type, and lastly, the life cycle of DPI itself. And in terms of next steps to this research, and just a note on the impact, as I mentioned, we've had some success embedding this work with emerging DPI in the country, which is thinking critically about governance. One of them is the Open Network for Digital Commerce, which is thought of as an e-commerce DPI. And as a part of that work, we translated a section on participatory governance to suit a network-based DPI like ONDC. And the other instance where we've had success is embed some of these principles in our ongoing engagement with MOSIP on gender and inclusion. With this, I
Thank
will
you.
stop. And yeah.